Hi, I'm Marie Pampanin, and I am here today with the most beautiful Meredith Phipps. She is a certified yoga therapist. We met over at MUIH, so she's part of cohort 10, which was our graduating cohort, and she is here to share a little bit about yoga therapy. Hello, Meredith. Thank you.
Absolutely happy to be here.
Thanks. And again, so grateful to have you with us. As you know, part of me bringing you on is to broaden the awareness of what yoga therapy is. So I thought we can maybe open up with what are your thoughts on what is yoga therapy?
This is one my husband laughs at all the time because I could go on forever about what is yoga therapy. But for myself, I think the best way that I use to describe it to other people, I do usually tell people it's a complementary healthcare practice. So the
Mhm.
reason I make the point to tell people that is because one, it is complementary in that it can work on its own, but it frequently works best when when we are coordinating with other providers, especially when we're working with more complicated conditions. And two, that it is a healthcare practice, because I think that sets it apart from just hearing the word yoga. Hearing the word yoga and yoga therapy is very important because it speaks to the different types of tools that we have in our tool belt to use. But the therapy portion, I think, gets lost in the mix of the name yoga therapy. And so instead of just like a private yoga session with someone, we really are targeting certain goals they have for their own health, including working with conditions, physical, mental, um, spiritual, psychosomatic. So a really wide range of conditions that we can work with. And that's the part that I feel like when I'm explaining to my students or to my clients or to anyone on the street, why I put those two together, complementary healthcare practice, working with a team of people really to meet you wherever you at in whatever condition or conditions you're dealing with at the time.
Beautifully stated. Okay, so one of the things that I also that kind of brought me to this podcast was the idea that when I would speak to people, which again, you said it very beautifully, is a lot of people don't understand necessarily the difference between a yoga therapist and a yoga
Mm-hmm.
instructor. hmm
Sure.
Especially because there are yoga instructors that, have a little bit more wisdom under their belt and they do, one-on-one. So would you like to speak into that?
Sure. I mean, I think I can certainly speak into that from my own personal experience as well. If I have someone at a studio that I'm working at who just wants to have a private yoga session with me, then we're primarily going to stick with their own yoga practice as far as it's always going to be personal goals. But we may be working more on what their postures look like. We may be working through a whole sequence of postures. Whereas when I work with somebody in a yoga therapy setting, I'm taking a healthcare intake. So I've got a whole, like you would when you go to a doctor that takes a long time to work through. So we're looking at the whole broad spectrum of physical, mental, even your community and your connection to what brings you joy in your life. All of those things are very important. Coming up with your goals for your health care and your overall wellness, not just a physical practice. And then you may only walk away with two or three practices to work on. So, a plan of care that includes two or three things for you to do in between the time we meet and the next time we meet, usually 2 or 3 weeks. And the reason that's important is because the focus is very different. As a, I don't want to say that a one-on-one yoga um, session would look more like fitness, but it does kind of fall a little bit more into that category than into your healthcare. And so, really, we're getting more into the nitty gritty. I'm trying to keep this very non-clinical because I can jump into the clinical language really quickly, and I'm trying to be just very broad for that reason and very
Mhm.
accessible because I want people to understand that we really are working with your whole healthcare. And in
Mhm.
the Western world, we're starting to understand this as something called the biopsychosocial spiritual model. And what that means is instead of coming to your doctor with like, I've got knee pain, and we're just looking at the knee. Um, in the biopsychosocial, we're looking at, well, why is your knee hurting that way? What ways are you sitting, or what are you doing with your knee? What
Mhm.
patterns are repeating? And maybe what emotions are behind that? What mental space is behind that? Is there anxiety? Is there stress? Is there tension in the body? Um, so that biopsychosocial is going to look at the whole picture together, and that's really what yoga therapy is doing. And a yoga session, while you could get into some of those things, is not looking at any of the healthcare aspect of that. It can be therapeutic, but it is not focused on the healthcare and wellness therapy side.
Thank you.
If that
Again,
makes
very
sense.
well stated. This is awesome. Okay, so, as I was listening to you, one of the things that came for me was, we're looking at people also from a holistic level, right? So the different koshas. How would you describe that?
Mm. Well, my own personal approach to that with my clients is we are looking at the physical. I like to explain this when we get into this. Most people who are coming to me don't know what the koshas are or what a kosha model is. So I explain that it's just basically sort of a 5 layer way to look at ourselves. It's not, some people say like Russian nesting dolls, but they kind of blend in and they affect one another. So one would be the physical body, and we're going to look at different imbalances. That's why we look at a musculoskeletal assessment, like you have almost when you go to a physical therapist. Very similar. Um, we're going to look at the breath and energy. That's also going to be your sleep. How is your breath working? We're going to do a breath assessment. We're going to see what those breath muscles are doing. And that affects our energy during the day, right? How we're feeling throughout the day, how we're sleeping. We're going to look at the mental side of that too: anxiety, depression, stress. And then the last two, the best way that I have to describe them is really your connection and community. What does your support system look like in your life? What kind of connections are you having, relationships you're having with other people? It doesn't border into counseling because we do have a scope of practice that stays out of that, but it is important to know what those connections are. And then the last
Mhm.
one is our connection to joy, or even our connection to our spirituality or faith. And that one is beautiful because it's not directed certainly by me. I'm not telling you what to believe or what not to believe, but that connection to something bigger than ourselves, or to joy, what brings us, as opposed to temporary happiness, something that we can even just think about, and no matter what situation brings us that welling up feeling in our body of satisfaction.
Mhm.
So those are the ways that I describe it when I'm working with clients, which seems to work pretty well so far as we dive into what that looks like in each of their lives.
Right. And in each of our clients' lives, as
Mhm.
well as our own lives,
Yes.
we
Yeah.
are unique. Yeah,
Yes.
definitely. So I appreciate you bringing that up. Um, you brought up the postures. So, of course, as yoga therapists, we are deriving those postures from yoga poses. You brought up energy. And then as you went into the emotional piece, you brought up scope of practice. We're not therapists per se, unless, of course, you're working with someone who is a therapist,
Right.
a mental therapist. Um, Scope of practice. What sets us apart from, say, a therapist, a physical therapist,
Mhm.
you know,
Right. Or a
a medical
counselor.
doctor?
Yes.
Exactly.
Right. I mean, we do have quite a bit of training, and this is actually one of the parts that makes it difficult, makes us need to be very mindful in our own practice as we're serving other people, as we're serving our clients. Um, my scope of practice is set within the scope of yoga. I'm going to be working within the kosha model that we just talked about. I'm going to be applying the tools and principles of yoga, breath practices, physical postures, our meditation, mindfulness, those tools that we have and practices that we've learned and continue to learn so well to the situation at hand and to each
Mhm.
person's goals. How that would differ from like a physical therapist, for instance, they're going to be looking at, now physical therapists do tend to look up and down the body and not just where the pain is, which is great, but they're going to stay in that physical body. They might add in some breath to that, but they're not going to get into the mental piece. They're not going to get into the joy or community connection because that's not their scope of practice. Um, a psychotherapist, this is where it gets tricky for me because my mom is a therapist. And so I was raised with that mentality and that language. And so I have to watch myself in my own sessions that I don't slide into, just because she used it with me when I was a teenager too. So it's hard sometimes to like remind myself I'm not diagnosing anything. Um,
Mhm.
as a doctor, as a physical therapist, I'm not saying you have a torn ACL or I'm not looking at any of that stuff. I'm looking at it, but I'm not diagnosing it. And that's really important too, because as yoga therapists, we might actually see signs of some of these things. And as a yoga therapist, because I cannot diagnose that, I'm going to refer you out to a medical doctor or a physical therapist or a psychotherapist to handle that side. And especially if there's a diagnosis, that's where that complementary healthcare practice comes back in.
Mhm.
But the yoga practices that we can apply specifically to those things have just shown such tremendous change, especially when it comes, certainly when it comes to wellness, but when it comes to perseverance through the suffering and perseverance through the circumstances. So it becomes this beautiful supportive practice that you can draw strength from your own self, draw strength from your community support or from your faith base, and
Mhm.
to walk you through whatever those circumstances are that you're going through at the time. And it
Yeah.
becomes, yeah, it becomes a very important piece of that support as you're working towards wellness.
Yes. And that is definitely something that I use quite a bit when I'm working with my clients as well is telling them about the resourcing, internal, external. I often use the analogy of a stool. If you're sitting on a
Mm.
stool, there's four legs, right? And so it keeps us from falling over.
Yeah.
And yeah. So we do have a scope of practice as certified yoga therapists. Would you want to speak into the difference between a certified yoga therapist versus a non-certified yoga therapist?
Sure. I think so. Our When you see the little letters, and you might be able to see them on the bottom of my screen now too. Marie also has them at the bottom of her name, probably with a whole lot more. So, but you see that little C-IAYT. IAYT is the International Association of Yoga Therapists, and the reason I even bring up their name in particular is because they've done a phenomenal job over the last 20 plus now years, just over
Yeah.
20 years, um, creating a not just a registry or not just an accountability, but a certifying body. So they're the ones who, if you become a certified yoga therapist, you go through over 800 hours of training. I believe with our masters, it's more than, I think we're closer to 1,000. Um, with I'd have to look back on that, but I'm pretty sure we're closer to 1,000 because we have the Masters of Science piece in that.
Hmm.
So you have yoga instructors who are using yoga in a therapeutic setting and in a therapeutic sense. And there are even some who are able currently to submit the body of work that they've done to IAYT to show that what they're doing is on par with what we are required, to the scope that we're required to work within as yoga therapists. But it really does make a difference. There's a lot of caution within the world of yoga using the word therapy, and calling what we do therapy without some type of accountability to how we're practicing, to what we're offering, and to how educated we are keeping ourselves, how up to date. So we're working within the evidence and research that's been given, along with the thousands of years of case studies that we have from yoga itself, but also within now more of the Western world research that is, there's a lot of research that's been done on yoga and how it impacts the body. And we have to work within those realms and within that scope. So we have the backup of the evidence. Certainly there are yoga instructors, as I said, who are using yoga in a therapeutic manner, but that really does set set those two, I think, apart, is that
Hmm.
we're required to be looked at by this very prestigious group who have done a lot of work to make sure that there's integrity in the work that we do and what we're specifically what we're offering clients. It's for the clients. It's
Hmm.
not to put the letters at the end of our name. It's to make sure that what we're offering is robust, evidence based, and truly serving the people that we're with.
Which also keeps us accountable because we do have that ongoing education and all of the research. And I love that there's so much research that, they are doing and the people around them are doing in order to create evidence-based,
Yes.
you know, um, things for us, specifically in how we're learning things,
Yes.
which is,
So much
I
so that,
personally think that's amazing.
yeah, and I mean, so much so that that's even an area of yoga therapy that we can go into
Hmm.
as yoga therapists, is as a researcher, right? So there are so many of us who are certified yoga therapists who are working in that route, like Marlisa Sullivan, of course, but even within like MUIH, we have a whole group that's working on a different study right now that's about to come out on how yoga therapy is used, how it's researched specifically the phrase yoga therapy. Um, when we were in our program together and everything that we looked at, I mean, the hours that we spent on PubMed or on Google Scholar or looking up there. I mean, there's thousands and thousands of evidence-based research projects out there, and so that's even part of our I don't want to say scope of practice, but part of our career path could be specifically in the research uh, realm.
Thank you. So, how about to get to become a yoga therapist? What was your journey, your road?
It was, I think, really stemmed out of my own personal practice, of course, which I'm sure it does for everybody. But my personal practice actually just began at a gym. I was a young mother, and even though I understood at the time I was being mentored by my mom in the world of PTSD and what PTSD is, and uh, that was her scope of study when she was getting her master's and becoming a counselor. Even having that knowledge, I did not want to see that that is actually what I was struggling with myself. So it really came to a head as a young mom, and I was going to a gym, and I would go to yoga, and even in this 24-hour fitness, just we get to Savasana, they would turn the lights out, and I would just weep on my mat.
Mhm.
For myself, I have a very personal relationship with God. I am a Christian, and that was this beautiful time when it was the only time I was still enough for God to come and minister to my heart, which was quite broken at the time. I went through a wonderful, beautiful therapy. We had a wonderful counselor who introduced me to another practice, which was somatic, working with the body. And Bessel van der Kolk and Peter Levine, fantastic pioneers in this area, have said that the body is included in the trauma, in creating the trauma. Why would the body not be included in the healing? And that really made a lot of sense to me, because yoga was where this piece was coming together. I was having this talk therapy, which was helpful, but really the somatic and the yoga connecting and being able to safely build a different relationship with myself, with my body, my heart, my mind. And that's what began to happen for me in yoga, was I was creating this new relationship with myself. Whereas before it didn't feel safe to have a relationship with myself, or at the very best, I was believing lies about myself. So I am a military wife. About that time, we went active duty and started moving from place to place every 2 to 3 years. And I met some of the most phenomenal women. Military spouses are incredible. Um, and I noticed that we carry a great deal of the load, especially my husband's and my um, heart really is for the whole military, but we have a special place in our heart for the special operations community, special forces. And seeing those wives and what they were handling while their guys were away, really wanted to offer them some peace that I had found. And so I went and got my 200 hour and began offering yoga to the wives around me. And as we entered the special operations community ourselves, my husband's assignments changed. I was able to offer that on a greater scope. And that's really where that trauma piece came back in for me. I thought, this is great to do this in a group setting. I would love to be able to offer this to anyone who would like to work one on one. And so I went back and got a trauma informed certification um, and began working with trauma survivors. And really, from that moment on, I just wanted more. Like, my hunger was just to be able to serve them better. And for me, that meant I want to understand this world better. I want to understand our bodies better. How do we create that better relationship, that stronger relationship with ourselves? And so when we moved to the DC area, I found MUIH and the Masters of Science in particular really appealed to me. The clinical side and being able to work within that scope felt like I could offer something safer to my clients. So it's kind of the broad scope of how I got to yoga therapy. But that's been my heart and my love. I love working with groups, but my favorite is to work with individuals. And my yoga therapy practice is actually called Essentia Yoga Therapy. It's a Latin word that means essence, like that spark. And for two reasons. One, because I felt deeply led in my own relationship with God to pursue this. That what makes God who he is what drew me and led me. Two, because that is the journey of our yoga practice, or especially yoga therapy practice, is finding that spark that's you, that's uniquely you. And so sometimes that's through, becoming stronger physically in the body. Sometimes that's by creating ease or peace and rest. Sometimes that's by creating better connections or more support outside, or connecting to that joy and that something greater outside of ourselves. And so Essentia Yoga Therapy was born recently, and in hopes that I would be able to give one-on-one support to people who are looking to build that relationship with who they uniquely are.
Thank you so much for sharing your journey, but also sharing how you came up with the name and the passion behind it and the belief, that we can, right? And I think that's the piece right there. We can become more insightful and connected to that authentic piece of who we are.
Yeah.
Um, One of the things that did cross my mind as we've been having this discussion is you commented on your faith, um, as well as this essence of who we are, right? And for some of us, we're going to have a different perspective on that. Do you have any thoughts around that, especially for, somebody who might not exactly know what their faith is, or if they even have a faith, or what does that mean? You briefly touched on it in the beginning, but I think that um, earlier in one of our personal discussions, you had spoken so and just insightful, yeah, so such insightful thoughts on it that I was hoping you could repeat that for us.
Hopefully I can too. I do remember it actually is a really deep part of my heart. One of the things that I value the most with each individual is the journey, right? It's not just that we can find that essence of who we are. Nobody defines that specifically for us, um,
Mhm.
but it is a journey. It is a discovery, and so you can hear my dog in the background. Um, it is a discovery, and that is something that each person individually has to go on themselves. I cannot dictate for someone what that journey will look like. In my own faith background, in my own tradition, I do believe that God directs that, regardless of whether that's where we end up or where we don't end up. If we end up believing in a one God, or this is how it looks like, or we end up in a different belief system. That is not for me to dictate, but I do believe that that journey is a beautiful part of understanding who you are,
Yeah.
and what it does lead to is a freedom to be who you've been created to be. um, that's going to look very different for every single person. It's not going to look this, it doesn't even look the same in my own household, right? We have 3 children, um, and it has looked like a very different journey for each of them. um, it does not look like sharing our same beliefs every single time just because that's what we share. It really is. So I want to honor that. I want to honor each traveler on that journey, which sounds almost a little woo woo. And I'm certain that there are some people in my same faith tradition that
Yeah.
may not like the way that I'm saying this. That's okay. Nobody has to like the way that I'm saying anything. But I respect deeply God's work from my own faith tradition in each individual person. If I believe what I say I believe, then I trust the God that I believe in. And that means that I trust in his way of doing things, which is not going to look the way that I think it needs to look all the time. Also, respecting deeply everyone else's journey and where they are in that journey. If I look back on my own life has not looked like Christianity across the board, even when I was saying that I was a Christian. It has gone up and down and up and down and up and down. This is not a linear, like this, the journey does not just look like this at all for any of us, right? One of the things
Right.
I've really appreciated recently is I've joined a philosophy class of a friend of ours from the cohort behind us, from cohort 11, and being able to hear from all the people who come to this class as we're working through like the Bhagavad Gita, or from different, all from different faith traditions, all from different places in that journey. Some of us not knowing where we're at, some of us knowing exactly where we're at, some of us knowing exactly where we're at from opposite ends of the spectrum, and all being very respectful and supportive,
Mhm.
understanding that we're not at the end of the journey yet. Like, this is part of understanding who we are, and being, when you become confident in who you are and the value you have, and being able to build that relationship with yourself, right? Beginning to have some of those inner resources, that builds your strength to begin to live out of who you are. Um, and it's not a euphemism for saying you get to do whatever you want to do and forget about other people. It actually begins to bring more compassion for other people around you, because you know how hard it was to work through that journey yourself. So I
Mm.
think it brings more patience and more compassion for the people around us. We are not the authors of the end of that journey or what that looks like. And so I think it begins to develop more respect for the people around us, and being able to share ideas and ask good questions and be curious about each other, and support each other while we're going through whatever we're going through.
I agree. And to sum that up, what a healing process that is,
Yeah.
not just for us as individuals, but for us in a much larger community, and dare I say, worldwide.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So thank you. That was wonderful. Um, so one of the things that you also brought up was how dear, you know, the military community is to you. And of course, we've had our own discussions around that because we both come from military backgrounds. You brought up PTSD and trauma. What are some of the areas that you feel very passionate about,
Mm.
that you can possibly share? Because one of the things that, has come up in this session, is that we are very unique. We are very unique even as yoga and therapists, right? So part of what happens is our credentials are going to look mildly different, or they might look the same, but even if they're the same, how we work with people is going to look different. And so I was hoping that you could share a little bit about what your passions are and what your focus might be.
Sure, absolutely. I think that's interesting because even as you were talking about that, I got the picture in my head of medical doctors, not because
Mhm.
we are medical doctors in the sense that we diagnose, but in the sense that they all go through medical school, right? And then they choose different areas of expertise. And maybe they have this area of
Yes.
expertise for a few years and then they go to this area of expertise or so I think that yoga therapy is similar in that sense. We all go through yoga therapy training and we all have yoga. Somebody who gets a certification in yoga therapy must be a yoga instructor, must have a 200-hour first. And I believe we have to have a certain amount of teaching hours before we go into that training, but we could look that up. But then we can all branch, right? Depending on what our other certifications are, other education is, or what our other career paths are. And so for myself, certainly PTSD is the foundation that brought me into that. My heart is really, even through our program, I took a deviation and a rest from PTSD from some of the crises that were going on in our own family, and that was good and right to put it down for a minute. And during that time, really began to have a love for working with TBI, with traumatic brain injury. And so as I came to the end of our graduation, and the God really brought PTSD, brought those things together. Well, I was an English major before this. So it really brought those things together for me, and working with PTSD and TBI um, is really a huge love of mine. So within the military community, what's interesting is my husband is a chaplain, and has worked with the chaplain school for a short period of time. One of his assignments was working with the chaplain school, where we found that the military has begun doing H2F, which is their health initiative. There's a
Mm.
field manual 7-22 out there, which talks about really a holistic view of soldiers' health, and of service. This is an Army document, so it is specifically soldiers, but for servicemen and women's health. Uh, and that includes looking at sleep, looking at breath, looking at physical postures, looking at stress, looking at their
Mm.
spiritual life, right? So we're already in the kosha models right there,
Yeah.
that we talked about earlier. So he and I have actually been able to do some work together and work with some military personnel, and that's just it's been an honor and always will be an honor to work with the military. So sometimes that's in the realm of PTSD or TBI. Sometimes that's
Mhm.
in the realm of how can I help you prepare for your school that you're going to, TRADOC, basic. TRADOC is a training um, environment. So your basic, or um, any of the airborne schools, ranger school, how can we help you perform better? Um, Working on core, working on your back, working on physical imbalances, working on sleep, working on Nidra. Can you imagine what it would be like for servicemen and women to go through something like ranger school and have Nidra in their back pocket? I
Oh,
mean,
that would be wonderful.
right?
Hmm.
So my son is currently finishing up basic and has aspirations, and I'm like, please let me teach this to you. So that's a big part of that heart for me. Having said that, I'm also working with our friend and you on we're working on a nonprofit to help build
Nice.
access for anyone who has suffered trauma and is not
Mhm.
able to get to these complementary practices, healthcare practices that would help. Maybe insurance doesn't cover them, or it's
Right.
not provided in their area. And so we're in the process of beginning that nonprofit because it matters to us that anyone who has suffered trauma would have access to recovery, that no one should be left without access to recovery. And frequently, in fact, always, when you're looking at Peter Levine, Bessel van der Kolk, who wrote The Body Keeps the Score, and Peter Levine, Waking the Tiger, and are just pioneers in this area, like we talked about before, frequently they'll even say it's usually more than one modality. It's usually not just
Yes.
talk therapy. It's also EMDR. It's also yoga therapy. It's also somatic experiencing. It's all of these things together that help people recover from trauma. Having said that, a, a big part of what I do is working with clients on what we would call big T trauma versus little t trauma. And we do not give those, um,
Mm.
we don't put those stipulations on someone's trauma. I don't say to a client, oh, you have big T trauma. Oh, you just have a little t trauma. It's really more of a stipulation that we put on ourselves. It's a label that we put
Yes.
on our own trauma of like, oh, that's not as big as what other people have. It's not like I've gone to war. It's not like, I haven't been abused. It isn't. And so we downgrade the experiences that we've had in our lives. And really, what we're talking about in a traumatic experience is something that's where the body is stuck there, where we
Mhm.
just maybe cognitively we've kind of pushed it in the past, or we don't think about it, or oh, that was just nothing. But our body still reacts to it, or we still have an emotional reaction or response to it that changes the clarity of thought or our ability to respond in a way that we feel like is appropriate. Um, and so I really want to be able to broaden the horizons for people, anyone who's walking through my door, because
Right.
we all have, whether you want to call it big T trauma or little T trauma, we have all had events in our lives that stick in our nervous system and prevent us from really living completely free of those things in our mind and in our heart and our body. So
Mm.
my desire, my hope is that every client I'm working with, I'm certainly not telling everybody who walks through my door, you have trauma. Because again, I'm not diagnosing that. That would be extremely inappropriate, right? I'm not thinking that
Out of
about
scope.
every, right? I'm not thinking that about every client that comes to me, but just by working through that kosha model that we were talking about earlier, it's really
Mhm.
amazing the freedom that people find to let go of things and
Mhm.
rebuild that relationship with themselves, rebuilding trust with their body, trusting their mind, beginning to learn to that it's safe to feel and acknowledge the sensations that you're feeling, even if it's hunger cues or sleep or um, the emotion that wells up, being able to trust some of those things or even just acknowledge them again. All of those things are
Yeah.
beginning to work to release stuck places in our nervous system, which is leading to
Mhm.
freedom and leading to that better relationship with ourselves.
Thank you. So that little word that you brought up, Nidra, would
Sleep.
you like to either share a little bit of Nidra or would you like to maybe tell us about Nidra?
Sure. I've not been watching the time, so I don't know how much time we
We
have left.
we do have about 10 more minutes, 5 to 10
Okay.
more minutes if you want to
I'll
do a
share what
little
it is.
experiential work.
Yeah, I'll share what it is, and we can share a little piece. We can share a little piece.
Okay.
But Nidra just means sleep. Actually, maybe it would be helpful for me to share how this has actually worked effectively in some of the lives of the clients that I've worked with without
Mhm.
obviously naming names. Or we are also bound by HIPAA. That does, you were asking earlier what separates a certified international like yoga therapist from somebody who's not certified. HIPAA is one of those answers. We are bound by HIPAA. So I can't just like, my client's name is, and this is everything that they're dealing with. But I have had multiple clients actually who have struggled with PTSD and some complex PTSD, which is repeated events over over a period of time. And in all of their cases, there's actually probably one or two that I haven't used Nidra in, but in two
Meredith,
in
let me
particular,
just let me step in really quick here because I do want to actually also clarify that um, these people have been diagnosed not by you, but
not by me.
by somebody else.
Yes, yes, thank you. Right,
So,
because as earlier when we were talking about if I see something that might be, I can't say this is what
mhm,
you, I can't even say I think this is what you have. I would
yeah.
never do that. That would violate my scope of practice. What I could say is, have you thought about seeing such and such a therapist or such and that, I have the name of someone if you're interested. How would you feel about trying therapy or trying, counseling or EMDR or have you, those types of questions and then being able to refer them out. So yes, these are people who've come to me already diagnosed. When we have that intake form that we talked about at the beginning of a session,
Mhm,
this is something that has shown up in there that they have shared voluntarily with me
right.
without story. And this is important when we're talking about trauma. When we're talking about yoga therapy and trauma, we don't have to deal with story. And what I mean by deal with, because that sounds horrible, is because I'm not the counselor, you don't have to share the story with me if you don't want to. And I have clients who I never ask for the story. I have some clients who choose to share a little bit or bits and pieces of the story with me, and I have some who choose not to share any of the story at all. Because we're working with the physical body and breath, and by physical body, I don't even mean touch. Um, I mean, maybe we're just working with moving our fingers, right? It doesn't have to look like a yoga class in the sense that we have in the United States of what a fitness class looks like. We might
Okay.
just be working with like shoulder rolls or whatever the client is comfortable with. I got a little off topic. Nidra. So, with my clients who have struggled with sleep, we have used Nidra, and I explained to them Nidra is it's just a yoga word for sleep. What we're doing is we're working with breath and a meditation and mindfulness to bring our brain into a nice theta wave sleep. It's almost like half awake, half asleep, and it's this place where your body is actually able to heal, or you got to be careful with that word too, don't we? Cellular regeneration is happening at a much different rate. Um, Thought processing is happening at a much different rate. Rest is happening in the body at a much different rate. There are some studies that show that while Nidra is not a replacement for sleep, that an hour of Nidra can be equal to 4 hours of sleep. So what it's helping with is settling the nervous system down to a place where our body can actually access some recovery and some full rest. You're listening to a guide. If I'm leading the Nidra, you're listening to my voice as we go through a process of usually like a hope or a prayer, setting an intention, simple breath practices, a quick body scan. And what I mean by that is we're just drawing our awareness to like the point between the center of the eyebrows, the hollow of the throat, the center of the chest, and we're going that fast. The reason we're going that fast is actually helping the brain waves to come into that theta wave relaxation state. So I get a little technical when I'm talking about this because when people don't know what Nidra is, for
Right.
me, I always wanted to know what is it? Like, I don't want to just jump into something without knowing what is it that I'm actually practicing. We might work with opposites where you're just thinking about hot. When you think about the word hot and you allow yourself to feel that, whatever comes to mind, it might be a picture, it might be a feeling, it might be an emotion, and then cold, and then allowing that. So we're working with opposites. So we're doing something very specific mechanically in the brain to help the brain relax the whole body. So I do use Nidra when it's appropriate, especially with sleep problems. I've recorded a few, and there's a lot of great recordings out there, but I've actually recorded one in Spanish with the help of some friends of mine in
Oh,
Spain.
Nice.
They did the recording because their Spanish is so much better than mine. I understand it well, and I wrote the Nidra, and then they helped me to record that into Spanish into a couple of those. So we're working on getting that into Insight Timer, and a
That's
couple of
awesome. Yeah.
yeah, very helpful with anyone who's struggling with rest. I use it on myself
Mhm.
because there's a certain sequence that we go through, setting our intention, working with breath, working through the body scan, working with opposites. There's a few different ways that you can do this, but we go through all of these different steps in a specific order. And it really is phenomenal the amount of rest and relaxation when people come out of it, how restored they feel.
Yeah. Thank you.
Sure.
That's wonderful. Okay, so um beautiful interview. I really appreciated all of the knowledge that you brought in, the perspective, um, what your passions are around yoga therapy, within yoga therapy. Now tell us, where can we find you?
Well, being a military spouse, I am nomadic. So we talked about that. I am all over the place. But I am on Instagram. I'm
Mhm.
currently in South Carolina, and I'm sure that we will not be there long. However, I am on Instagram under Essentia Yoga Therapy. You spell it just like essential without the L. So ESSENTIA, Yoga Therapy. I am on LinkedIn, and I do have a website that's coming out probably in the next month. That is essentiayogatherapy.com. And I will have many, many resources there. I am beginning to take virtual clients, especially as we were just discussing before recording what that looks like as I move from place to place. I love working in person too. So I do some speaking engagements and I do workshops. I actually have a workshop coming up in April in Arizona. So a few different places, but the best place to reach me is probably Instagram and the upcoming website, InnocentiaYogaTherapy.com.
Thank you. As we close, is there anything else that you would like to share?
Honestly, there is one thing that's still on my heart because we've mentioned, we've opened the Pandora's box just a little bit in talking about being a Christian and being a
Mm-hmm.
yoga therapist. Um, for myself, we've talked about what that's like for people who are on the journey who may not. Um, they may not be in a place where they believe in God at all at the moment. They're on
Mm-hmm.
that journey. There may be some Christians who call themselves believers who um, might struggle with some of what I've discussed too. And with that, I just am wide open to having those conversations as well because what I've found and what my heart is that within the church, um, I can speak to the United States, but within the church in
Mm-hmm.
the United States, sometimes we bottle a lot of that stuff in and we have trauma too, and we've been created for that wholeness. So our bodies are created for balance. When we're out of balance in that trauma, we were designed to handle that traumatic event. We were also designed to recover from that traumatic event. Those things are true regardless of what we believe, right? That's how our body works. And so there are times in our life, and I do see this in our church, where we can hide that underneath faith, putting on a happy face. I should feel this way, or I shouldn't feel this way because I'm a Christian. God still intends for us to work through that trauma too. And so being able to do that is a very personal walk and very personal relationship journey with God, just as much as it is with ourselves. And I'm speaking specifically to believers here, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
So I would encourage those believers to dive into that relationship with Him and even just ask, what does that look like to dive in and heal from my trauma, as opposed to just making everything look like it's okay.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm hoping that believers and non-believers alike
Yeah.
do really take to heart what you just shared because it is an important journey of, again, I'll bring this up again because I said it earlier. It is an individual journey, but it is a humankind journey as well.
Mm-hmm.
And the more we open up to our own healing, the more we open up to a worldwide healing.
Yes.
So I
Compassion,
really
freedom,
appreciate, yes,
patience. Yes.
compassion, empathy,
Mm-hmm.
and knowing that we're all at different stages. Different stages doesn't mean, oh, they're just at a different stage, but,
Yeah.
we are at different stages. So and we do, every one of us,
Yeah.
again, want to bring this up. We all each have a gift that we bring into the world.
Mhm.
So
Thanks.
thank you. Thank you
Absolutely. Thank you for
so
having me.
much.
It's
Oh,
always,
that was
always,
wonderful.
always, always a joy to talk to you. Always. You know.
Thank you.